Okay, I think we can start if it's okay. Okay. So hello everyone and welcome to today's Data to Action or Business Intelligence webinar series hosted by the Economic Development Department of the Sud-Est Regional Commission. So this is our 8th session and it's always great to see such a strong and continued engagement around those discussions. Today we'll be focusing on Vision 2035. So it's a regional project carried out over the past year, I would say, across all the Southeast region. So as part of this initiative, forward-looking analysis were developed for 12 municipalities, looking at where those communities are today and more importantly, where they're heading, particularly in terms of population, workforce, and economic development. So at its core, this work is about understanding more what each community will need to sustain its workforce and support the long-term economic growth, especially in this context of Asian demographic and also the evolving economic opportunities. So one of the key message I would say that came through reading all the reports clearly is that while each municipalities have very different, or the municipalities have different realities, they also are deeply interconnected through a shared labor market, commuting patterns across the region, and also broader economic linkage across the region. So to walk us through all those findings, I'm very pleased and honored to welcome David Campbell, who conducted this work. Thank you so much, David, for accepting our invitation and for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. So quick introduction. David is the president of GPA Consulting, an economic development consulting and research firm based here in New Brunswick. He has more than 30 years of experience working in the industry with nonprofit organization, government across Canada, with a strong focus on Atlantic Canada. So he previously served as a chief economist with the government of New Brunswick, and many of you may also be familiar with his work through the Substract, It's the Economy Stupid, or the Insight podcast. He's also a fellow with the Public Policy Forum. So we'll start by setting the stage. So I did give a quick introduction about the work, but if you can briefly explain what Vision 2035 is, and how this work was conducted across those 12 municipalities, and what key question it was designed to address.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the Southeast New Brunswick region, as we're defining it here, is the counties of Westmoreland and Albert. So it doesn't include Kent County, just for the purposes of our analysis. But inside that region, there are 12 distinct municipalities, and they all have, significantly different economies. We have very rural economies like the community of Three Rivers, and of course, very urban economies like the city of Dieppe and the city of Moncton. So the purpose of the report was to do a sort of economic profile, demographic profile of each of the communities, understand their differences, understand their demographic realities, their industrial base, et cetera, and then, as you indicated, point to what are the sort of linkages and overlaps and interconnectedness across this regional economy. So that was the purpose of the report. But we also looked at the future. The reason it's called Vision 2035 is we wanted to understand how these things are evolving. And of course, every community is different. If you look at the city of Dieppe, only 19% of the workforce are over the age of 35. If you look over the age of 55, if you look at some of the rural communities, it's closer to 35% of the workforce is over the age of 55. So we wanted to understand the different demographic realities. And so we did population projections, 3 different scenarios for population growth in each of the 12 municipalities. And we showed what kind of population growth they would need to sustain a workforce and grow a workforce into the future. So the reports were meant to show the municipalities, what their community could look like by 2035, and then have a conversation about what types of industries and economic opportunities they would have. And then what do they need to think about in terms of housing and infrastructure development and other types of investments that they need to make in the years ahead. So it was really about sort of setting the table for each of these communities around the potential future and the future opportunities, and get them thinking about what they need to be focused on in terms of housing and in terms of trying to attract population and the industrial growth opportunities that each of them have. And then at the end of the process, sort of rolling that all together. And that's the report we're just finalizing now that looks at how they're all interlinked. And that's one of the fun things about this process is that, you've got a fishing industry, in sort of Shediac and Cap Acadie in that area, and that integrates well with the transportation infrastructure in the cities of Moncton and Dieppe. And you've got lots of other linkages like that we can talk about if you'd like.
Thank you so much, David. That's really helpful context for putting the context here. So from this work, what are the most important structural trends shaping the future of the region, particularly in terms of population, workforce, and economic development?
Well, on the population front, the good news is that all of the municipalities, all 12, have actually been growing their population. So this is quite unique in the context of Atlantic Canada. So what is happening is that the whole region's population is growing at different rates, some communities faster and some communities slower. But the good news is all communities are growing. People are moving into the region. Some are choosing to live in rural areas. Some are choosing to live in urban areas. Some are choosing to live in the periphery of the urban area. So the good news is we're showing that no matter where the community is located in the Southeast, that people are moving to those communities. So that's the good news on the population front. Now, moving forward, we have to make sure that we sustain population growth, and some communities will need different levels of population growth if they want to, account for the changing workforce realities in their community. So that's the good news on the population front. On the economic front, as I kind of indicated earlier, it's an amazing to go and look at it by municipality. It's amazing to show the differences. If you think about a community like Fundy Albert, which has huge tourism resources, there's even potential mining opportunities. And then you flip the other side, you've got the fishing sector on the Northumberland Strait side of things. You've got the university in Tantramar. You've got some big federal government assets. You've got agriculture across the entire region in relatively small amounts, but certainly lots of potential for growth in agriculture. And then you've got the urban core. So there's great synergies between, the food service and accommodation sector in the urban core compared to the tourism assets that are in the rural and the smaller communities. So there's great synergies there. So I would say one of the great learnings for me through this process is that despite the similarities, the interconnectedness of the regional economy, it is absolutely true that each community has distinct opportunities for growth in the years ahead. There's even aquaculture opportunities that we looked at. If you look at the smaller communities, making sure that there's services, whether that's healthcare services or personal services or retail, no matter where you are in the region, if you've got enough demand for a specific service, that we should be working to make sure that these services are available in communities from one end of the region to the other. And then looking at those opportunities that maybe are more export focused, again, whether it's natural resources based opportunities, agriculture, tourism, and things like that. So I think there's, again, on the population front, good news is the workforce is growing, or the population is growing. On the workforce front, we've got more challenges there because of the fact that such a large share of the population is heading toward retirement in the next decade. By 2035, there will be tens of thousands of people retiring from the workforce across the region. And we need to make sure we're replacing those by attracting young families and young workers into the workforce. Again, whether you're a small community like the community of Three Rivers or the large city of Moncton, we need to be thinking about what that means in terms of making sure we've got the infrastructure for that. And I know in some of the smaller communities, that's looking at things like making sure we've got good K to 12 education, good healthcare services, good recreation infrastructure in the smaller communities, making sure that they're attractive for young families. And there's lots of work being done from one end of the region to the other to work on that and make sure we have that. And then ultimately making sure we've got the housing stock that we need from one end of the region to the other. And again, can be a big challenge. A lot of the municipalities that we looked at don't have a recent history of building a lot of houses. And so we do need to be thinking about what that looks like for, again, communities large and small across the region. But the opportunities are there, the potential is there. There's certainly risks. If you think about what's happening nationally with the curtailment of permanent resident admissions and international students, that poses a specific risk for our region as it does for the whole province. But the general, I come away from this report, I come in this process being pretty optimistic about the future of this region.
Perfect. Thank you, David. So you've said positive things about the population growth, but there is also we see a demographic pressure across many communities. We're seeing a decline in natural population growth and significant aging across municipalities, especially smaller or rural community like Fendi Albert and Three River. So how do these demographic pressure translate into concrete workforce challenges such as replacement need, labor shortages across those different type of municipalities?
Yeah, as I indicated, the challenges are different depending on where you go in the region, but they exist across the entire region. So even in the urban center where the population is younger, there's still going to be thousands of people retiring between now and 2035, and they will need to be replaced in the workforce. If we want to grow the workforce, we'll need additional people to meet those growth opportunities. Over the long run, there's a strong correlation between economic growth and workforce growth. And of course, there's lots of issues. We don't discuss a lot about technology and artificial intelligence and robotics and automation. Those things are sort of alluded to maybe in parts of this report, but really we're thinking about more generally how you make sure you have a population base in these communities, how you have a strong sort of demographic balance in these communities so that, the communities are not sort of aging out and cannot provide the workforce for local industry, particularly industries that are export focused or tourism focused, let's say. I think that the challenge is laid out quite firmly in this report, and the three population scenarios that we do for each of the communities, sort of lays out pretty clearly what kind of population growth we're going to need, whether it's 1.5% per year or 2.2% per year, or in some cases even slightly higher than that. If you're going to meet workforce demand in the years ahead. Now, we talk about it in all the reports. The regional workforce is quite integrated. So people do live in Dorchester and work in Moncton, and live in Dieppe and work in Dorchester, and work in Shediac and live in Moncton and live in Capillet and in Quebec and work in Shediac. So there's all of that sort of workforce mobility. But as a whole, we need to make sure we have a growing population, particularly on the younger side, to make sure we can meet those demand opportunities. Because what's for sure is that New Brunswick as a whole needs to have a strong economy here in the southeast. We've done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of economic growth over the past 20 years for New Brunswick in general. And as we look to the future, this region should continue to drive economic growth for the province. But it needs a strong population growth and a workforce to meet the demand of industry, whether that's in the cities, looking at professional services, information technology, and other services-based industries, or whether that's in the rural areas, looking at fishing. I was one of the things I was not completely surprised about, but very interested to find out all the significant manufacturing that's going on across the region. So it's not just in Dieppe and Moncton and Riverview. We have lots of manufacturing thousands of jobs in manufacturing all around the entire region. And again, if that's going to continue, you've got to have a workforce for that manufacturing industries, and then the natural resources, agriculture, and so on. So each report lays that out on a sector by sector basis, and points to the need for a targeted approach to workforce development across the region. And of course, we can work as a region through the Southeast Regional Service Commission and other partners. We can look at sort of regional workforce issues, but at the end of the day, there's very specific opportunities at the community level from one end of the region to the other.
Yeah, so we've already covered like half of the next question. It was about like the growth requirements. So if building on that, some municipality require significant population growth just to maintain their workforce. So what level of population growth is realistically needed, and what are the economic risks if that growth does not materialize? What can be the risks?
Yeah, so as I indicated, we did look at three population scenarios for each municipality, and the model was not uniform across all 12. But we were looking at trying to help municipalities understand the population growth needed if they want to maintain the local workforce or grow the local workforce. So again, in this sort of weird reality, a smaller community like the community of Three Rivers, let's say, or let's say Fundy Albert, actually would need a faster population growth than in the city of Dieppe, because the demographic situation is not as good in those communities in terms of the share of the population that's about to retire in the next 10 years. So in fact, some of these communities would probably need to see 2.5, maybe even 3% growth in the population if it was to grow the workforce. So again, some of these inter-regional linkages around workforce are going to come into play. But having said that, if you look at like communities like Shediac and Tantramar, they have, and Cap-Acadie, they have been growing their population at rates around 2 and even as high as 3% per year, depending on how many years you go back. So they have seen strong population growth. And even a community like the community of Three Rivers or Fundy Albert have seen population growth in the 1 to 1.5% growth rate per year. So we have a track record there, places like Salisbury and even Maple Hills. So we have a track record of population growth already. It's just that some of these regions will need even faster growth. And again, they may not see that level of growth. There's no guarantee that communities will see the same level of population growth in the years ahead, and a lot of it has to do with access to housing and services. But what we're trying to challenge the municipalities is to think about, what kind of community do they want to be in 2035, and then work backwards and make sure you've got the economic development planning and the population growth planning and the housing development and the services development to meet that vision for your community. So that's the vision 2035. So what do you want to be? Straight Shores by 2035. What do you want to be? Three Rivers. What do you want to be? Memramcook. We've talked to all of the, presented in front of the council and talked to the staff of these municipalities, and got a good sense of what they want to do. And hopefully these reports are helping them in terms of framing up what they want to do moving forward. But I think I don't want to put a negative spin on it, but the truth of the matter is we will need to see continued population growth. I know some people have gotten a little bit, I don't know, cranky is not the right word, but, because we are seeing population growth in the region and we're seeing it's pushing up housing prices, although things have moderated recently on that front. There's more congestion on the roads and things like that. So some people are saying, well, why do we need growth? And I think one of the things we're trying to do in these reports is make the case for at least a moderate level of population growth moving ahead, if we want to ensure we have a strong and prosperous regional economy here in the Southeast.
Yeah, and of course, immigration is a key part of that discussion, especially in urban or larger urban center like Moncton and Dieppe. So growth is increasingly driven by immigration. So to what extent does this create a structural dependency, and how exposed is the region to the changes in federal immigration policies?
Yeah. So if you go back 15, 20 years, 30 years, almost all of the population growth in this part of the province was either through what's called natural population growth, which is more births and deaths every year, or from intra-provincial migration. So people moving in from other parts of New Brunswick moving into the region. And so that was quite it drove pretty solid population growth in this area. If you look at the 80s, 90s, and so on, even the early 2000s. But the reality is that the demographic situation across Canada, the demographic situation in New Brunswick is such that that source of population growth is not going to continue to provide the same level of growth it did in the past. As a big example of that, almost all of the 12 communities, I think all but one or two of the 12 communities, and maybe even all of them, have a negative natural population growth rate now, meaning that every year more people die than are born in the municipality. So I don't want to be sort of macabre about it or talk about death. And I mean, and this is not the point. But as a general rule, if you don't have population migration and there's more people dying than being born every year, you're on a pretty terminal trajectory as a community. And that's just the reality. And that's not just here, that's across the country. It's just more of an issue here. So there are places in Ontario and Western Canada where there's a very strong positive natural population growth rate. Place like Peel, just outside of Toronto in Ontario, 176 births for every 100 deaths every year. If you look at some of the rural communities in the southeast here, it's only like 50 births for every 100 deaths, and so in one case even 40. So that's just the reality we face. So that means you have to attract population if you're going to grow your communities, because you're not generating enough population growth internally. And the reality is, because so much of this challenge is national in scope, it's harder and harder to attract people from other parts of Canada. So we have done some of that, particularly since the pandemic. We've attracted more people from Ontario and elsewhere. If you look at the annual numbers, that's starting to peter out. There's less and less of that now coming from other parts of Canada. So that means immigration is going to play a very, very important role in the future of this region. It has in the last, say 5 to 10 years, it has immigrants coming have played a very, very important role helping to build our communities, helping to meet workforce demand, helping to boost enrollment in our post-secondary education system. And so it's been an incredibly important and positive story. If you look across the entire province, we don't have the data for the Southeast, but I'm sure it's similar here. If you look across the entire province, the share of the people born in New Brunswick and participating in the workforce, or the number of people born in Canada and participating in the workforce across New Brunswick, has declined in the last 10 years. So all net growth in the workforce across the country has been immigrants or international workers. So that's the good news. We need to make sure we continue that into the future. But immigrants are going to play a fundamentally important role. Now, I would say we've gotten better. We certainly have a lot of work to do, but we've gotten better at trying to align the folks coming into the occupations and opportunities that are here in the community. Obviously, I think we could do a lot better on that front, but certainly compared to 10 years ago, we've gotten better at that. And at the end of the day, that's the bottom line, because if you have immigrants coming and they can't find a job that's matched to their education, skills, and interests, they tend to leave the community over time. But if we can do a better job of aligning on the workforce front and then doing better in terms of helping them settle in the community and put down roots, I think we'll have a better long-term retention of newcomers in the community. But I'll just say one other thing. We only, and then it depends on the time frame you look at, depends on the data you look at, but we only retain about 70% of our own kids. So it's pretty hard to say, well, we're going to have 90% immigrant retention, right? When you can't even retain 70% of your own kids. So the bottom line is, in a small jurisdiction like southeastern New Brunswick, there's going to be lots of people moving in and out for a lot of reasons. Some people want to live in a big city. Some people want to live whatever. Some people's career will take them. If you want to be a brain surgeon, there's not a lot of opportunity for brain surgeon in Moncton. So at the end of the day, people move in and out for a wide variety of reasons. But we've had success here attracting people, and I think we need to realize that as we look to the future, we're going to continue to need to attract and be attractive to immigrants and international students in our region.
Thank you so much, David. So another important insight from the work is how interconnected the region really is. We see a strong commuting flows across the municipalities with many people working outside their workplace of residence. So how this dynamic impact the rural communities in terms of workforce retention and the local economic activity?
So when you look at the data from the census, about 50%, just under 50% of the people who commute to work every day, so they don't work from home, about 50% of them actually they don't work in the same community that they live. And that's from the 2021 census. So that what that says is one out of every two will leave their community. So they're living in Dieppe, or they're living in Tantramar, or they're living in Salisbury, and they're working in another community. So that is sort of the number one sort of indicator of the integrated nature of the workforce and economy in this region. People are choosing specifically to live in Maple Hills or Shediac or Cap-Acadie, even though their job is in another municipality. So they have to commute to this other municipality for work every day. Now, people don't commute. Very few people commute for an hour. There's not a lot of that in this region, but people certainly do commute 15, 20, 25 minutes, to get to their job. So they're consciously making a decision. I want to live in Tantramar, even though my job, let's say, is in Dieppe or vice versa. So that's a really good news story because it does point to the integrated nature of the population and the workforce. And in terms of other interconnectedness, again, we look at that quite a bit in this report. There's lots of supply chain linkages between the rural and urban areas. There's lots of industrial linkages. But even more so on the services side, in the large urban center, you have more professional services, specialized legal, accounting, engineering, architecture type services, that work to support companies across the entire region. If you look at the urban center, which is basically Moncton, Riverview, and Dieppe, you have significantly more big box retailers and sort of the stores and retail stores that require a larger population base. Whereas in the smaller communities, you tend to have retailers and services that support the local community. So you can see a movie, you can take in a show, you can do all kinds of entertainment and recreation activities across the entire region because we have a population base now of 250,000 or so people. We're able to offer a broader range of services because you can take advantage of that larger population base. So each individual community has its own strengths, but collectively the region is much stronger because it acts as an integrated economy. It's got pretty good transportation infrastructure through the region. It's got pretty good broadband infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure across the region. There's gaps in certain areas, and we talk about that in the reports. You're starting to have an integrated tourism infrastructure, trails, walking trails, things like that across the region. So, yeah, so that's certainly one of the key themes that comes out of this report is that the region does have very many interconnected attributes, and urban areas benefit from the rural areas, and the rural areas benefit from the urban areas.
Okay, thank you so much, David, for those insightful points. So let's turn to the structure of local economy. So you've mentioned before, like there is a diversified economy in urban center and more specialized one in area like tourism, agriculture, and resource-based activity in places like smaller maybe Shediac or Fendi Alberts as an example. So how does this specialization affect resilience to economic and technological shocks? And how can it also become a competitive advantage?
So, well, first of all, in terms of a competitive advantage, it means that if you just, no matter where you decide to locate in the region, you have close proximity to some very specialized services, specialized infrastructure, post-secondary education, R&D assets, specialized, accounting firms and legal firms and architecture firms, as I said earlier. So I think that's the real sort of benefit of that approach is that you've got access to urban services no matter where you locate in the region. It also helps ensure that you don't have a lot of supply chain leakage. You might have some, but if as long as you can access those services in the region, we don't have to leave the region to access the services. So that's another benefit to this issue of scale. So I think that's the reality of the interconnectedness of the industrial base of the entire region. But having said that, again, the magic of this, or the real sort of engine of this, is that in each community we also have different strengths and different assets and different attributes. So there's really great restaurants around the region. So people will drive from the urban core to access some of the restaurants and some of the services, and certainly the tourism infrastructure that we have across the entire wider region. So I think and again, as we look to the future, one of the sort of messages for the municipalities is that if you're not deliberate about that, if you're not working on that, if you think about the wineries in the region and some of the really cool sort of tourism slash agriculture based assets around the region, that over time things can atrophy. If you're not working on economic development in the community, you won't see these entrepreneurs, these opportunities emerging across the entire region. And that was something I didn't mention either. We do talk about the age of the entrepreneurial class or the business owner class across the Southeast, and that's actually older than the general population. So across the region, about 1 in 3 business owners is over the age of 55, and in some communities it's closer to 40% or even higher. And so we just need to make sure, as we look to the future, that we have this base of entrepreneurs owning businesses, operating businesses across the region, coming up with interesting new entrepreneurial ventures across the region. That's been a real benefit to the Southeastern economy for many generations, is that it's been very entrepreneurial, and we need to make sure that remains the case for the future.
Yeah, so and building on that idea, so you've also already answered some of the question, but it's given this strong interdependence between those municipalities. So how can the region, the Southeast region, better leverage the urban and rural linkage and to strengthen the overall economy or the regional economy?
Yeah, so there really is an opportunity to work together as a region, with the services, Regional Services Commission, but also with other partners, provincial government partners, post-secondary education. So the bottom line is, even though there's whatever it is, 250,000 or so population across the region, we're still relatively small. So we need to look to ways we can work together. And economic development is a good example of that. Each individual municipality, the larger ones have dedicated staff for economic development. The smaller municipalities, not as much. And so if you look at the economic zone that we would call southeastern New Brunswick, there's tremendous opportunity to work together on population attraction, on workforce development, on economic development, on infrastructure planning, on recreational planning, even on things like how we make sure that the older population has good services across the region. We want the southeastern part of New Brunswick to be a great place to retire, and it is a great place to retire. We need to continue that as we look to the future. So I think there's real potential for greater collaboration and regional thinking, because it's a regional economy. Economies don't conform to municipal boundaries. They conform to regional realities. So, how far will people commute for work? How far will people commute to access services, for entertainment, for recreation? And so this is the benefit of being able to work as a wider region. You have a population base that's larger. Again, a 250,000 population is not a large population in the national or international context, but it's large enough to be able to work together and plan together and work on things like economic development planning as a region. So I think that's one of the sort of, I think, key findings of this whole process is that, while we need municipalities to take control and have leadership about what's happening in their communities, at the same time we need to be having this bigger picture and thinking about regional issues and ways to work together regionally so that we can strengthen the regional economy and at the same time support the individual municipalities. But I don't want the lesson to be that individual municipalities can just say, okay, we're not going to do anything, because this is all being done at the regional level. That's not the conclusion, because obviously you can have a very successful region, but you can have individual municipalities that are not as successful or even struggling, because they haven't thought through, what they're going to do vis-a-vis housing and services and trying to grow the opportunities that exist in their individual municipality. So yes, tremendous opportunity to work together as a region, but also individual municipalities need to take advantage of the opportunities that are facing their specific community.
Okay, and some are limited by, you mentioned their capacity. So capacity is also an important part of the conversation. So there are important difference in municipal capacity, how those gaps affect the ability to act on opportunities, and how can smaller municipalities position themselves effectively in this case.
Yeah, so again, that's another reason why we can work together. So, for example, if you think about entrepreneurial support services, those could be done and can be and are being done regionally. So there's lots of ways, we can work together on issues that affect the entire region. But in the individual communities, we still need to have some thinking about what are the opportunities here, what do we need to work on here, and working with partners, whether it's CBDCs or the Regional Services Commission or other groups, to try to develop those opportunities. So one of the things, for example, that came out quite distinct in most of these reports was the need for healthcare services. So you're not going to put, a fully integrated hospital in every small community. That just doesn't make any sense. But you need to have physicians' offices in all of these communities or most of these communities. You need to have allied health services, dental services, and optometry and physiotherapy. If there's enough demand in a local community to have healthcare services in that community, we need to be thinking about how we offer those services. It's not efficient to force, let's say, older people from rural Fundy, Albert, to drive all the way into the city of Moncton to access, their family doctor or to access a physiotherapist, if there's enough demand to have that service in the community. And so, one of the things I think we concluded in this process, and it's not just public services, but it's certainly private services as well, whether it's personal services or professional services or retail. If you have enough demand in the community for that service, we should be working to ensure that those services are available at the community level. And then there'll be a whole bunch of things that there's not enough population demand for, like you're not going to have a movie theater in all 12 communities across the region. So if you want to see a movie, you're going to have to go to an adjacent community to see a movie, let's say, as one example. But where there is enough population and enough demand, across the region, we need to make sure we're working on those services. And some of that can be coordinated and worked on regionally. But at the end of the day, I would still argue that individual municipalities need to kind of have a vision for that. And what do we want to do about healthcare? What do we want to do about services? Where are we going to put them? What's our main street look like? Let's say as an example. And then what about the workers who work in those industries? So it's a bit of a joint approach. But it is true, if my community only has, 5 or 6 thousand people, the capacity to actually develop those opportunities is much more limited. And that's where, developing partnerships with the Southeast Regional Services Commission and provincial agencies and other partners can help sort of fill in the blanks. Like I said, on the entrepreneurial support side, there's no reason why that can't be done regionally, and is being done regionally, even though the individual entrepreneurial opportunities are out in the individual 12 communities.
Thank you so much, David. Another key dimension is how we approach growth. So there is a strong focus, as we've mentioned, on population growth, but also a need to improve the productivity. So how can the region balance to ensure there is a sustainable economic growth?
Yes, that's a really good question. So one of the challenges we've seen province-wide and actually across Atlantic Canada in recent years is that many of our industries have actually gotten less productive. So we've seen population growth, and that has brought people in to work in these industries, but employers haven't necessarily felt the need to become more productive because they've had a pool of labor. And this is particularly true in service industries like food service and retail and things like that, but also in manufacturing and other industries as well. So we do have to, I like to say, you have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to have population growth, but we also need to be looking at productivity, because we have to have industries that are competitive and that can provide, their goods and services in a competitive fashion. Particularly those industries that are traded, in other words, that are facing competition from outside the region or that export into other jurisdictions. And so that requires a focus on productivity and innovation, and trying to be really good at what we do. And so that's has to be part of the solution here. We need provincial, programs to support productivity, and we have those regional programs. But as a general rule, we need to be focused on productivity. I think one of the things that some economists believe is the way you do that is by squeezing the workforce really tight. In other words, you say, we're not going to grow the workforce, we're not going to grow the population, and that'll force employers to become more productive. And the reality is, if you look at the actual facts, what happens is, and it's happened in this region, is that businesses, if they can't find enough workers, they'll move their business somewhere else. And that's not a good outcome. If you go back 20 years in the Moncton and Dieppe area, there was a whole industry that catered to the production of bottled water and soda. And it was a whole industry, right? We had bottle manufacturers here. We had Pepsi, we had Coke, we had private label, the whole thing. And now that entire industry is in Brampton, Ontario, because the wages were cheaper and there was access to much more workers. So I would just caution people that, if your vision is, let's not attract newcomers to the region, let's sort of squeeze and tighten the labor force, and that'll force employers to become more productive. If they have the opportunity to invest their capital elsewhere to do the same thing, they will do that. And we've seen that already. If you look at, there was an industry in the Moncton area that was successful for many years. Some people called it call centers. It was business services, support, and administrative services. That was the general industry. For about 15 or 20 years, it grew very strongly in this part of the country. And now it's growing fast. It's shrinking significantly here, and it's actually growing in Toronto. And if you look at the wages, we used to have a 20 or 30% wage advantage compared to Toronto, and now basically the wage differential has disappeared. And so employers are now growing that industry again closer to their head offices in Toronto. So that's just a cautionary tale that for those out there that think the solution is to shrink the workforce or tighten the workforce or not attract immigrants or not attract international workers, and that'll force our employers to become more productive, I don't think we have, the data to suggest that would be the case. So we need to do both. We need to be able to grow our population, grow the workforce, but also encourage our employers through policies, through tax policies and other efforts, through deployment of technology, the deployment of capital, to become more productive so that it can be more competitive. and more successful in our region. But I don't think the solution is to do that by squeezing or tightening the workforce in a undue way.
Yeah, thank you, David. So looking ahead, the sector transformation, another transformation in the sector will also play a major role. We're talking about the projected growth in sectors such as healthcare, construction, and services. So how can municipalities better align their workforce development and talent retention strategy with those future needs?
Well, there needs to be a workforce sort of a broad outlook for the workforce, and I know the Southeast Regional Services Commission is looking at that and has done some work in that area. But we do need to have a broader understanding of the types of workers we're going to need and be focused on that both through the post-secondary education system and through immigration programs. And so one of the industries I'm very concerned about is construction. I've recently completed a report for the Public Policy Forum that looks at workforce supply and demand across Atlantic Canada, not specific to one region, but across the region. And my prediction is we're going to need a lot of growth in the construction workforce, even as a large share of that workforce is older. It's 55 plus and heading toward retirement. So I think in the case of the construction industry, we need to be very focused. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to build the houses you need. You're not going to be able to invest in the large infrastructure projects that are coming across the province and across the region. So I think we're going to have to do a whole lot and be very focused on construction and attracting and growing the size of our construction workforce. And again, for some of those specialized skills, it takes time. You don't become a red seal electrician overnight. It takes many years. Now, we're doing some positive things at a provincial and national level in terms of recognizing the skills of international migrants in the construction occupations, which is really good. But at the end of the day, I think we do have to zoom in. Healthcare is another one. We have seen a significant increase in enrollment in nursing programs, both here in the region, but also across the province. And I think that's very important because if you look at the outlook for healthcare occupations, the fastest growing in the top of that list is nursing. And so you get lots of nurses heading out the door in retirement, but you're also going to need many more for growth. And so we need to just put a focus on attracting nursing people into the nursing field. Now, I will say, coming back to the technology thing, there are people that suggest that technology, AI, robotics, automation is going to dramatically decrease the number of these workers that we're going to need in the future. My position on this is you really can't wait around and hope for the best. So 10 years ago, I was in a seminar and the speaker in the seminar said within 10 years, he said by 2025, all of the trucks would be driverless. So every truck on the road would not have a driver. This was 10 years ago, 2015, 2016. And here we are, 10 years later, and every truck still has a trucker. There isn't a single driverless truck on the road in Canada. Now, there's people working on that. There's people working on that technology. But if 10 years ago we said, well, we're not going to need any more truckers, so let's just stop training truckers, by today we would be in a massive, massive challenge. So I look at these technologies like AI and other emerging technologies as they're going to augment, they're going to support, they're going to supplement, they're going to make us more productive. But I would caution people that think they're going to dramatically reduce the number of workers. And even if it does, the risk is too high to say, well, we're just going to stop training these people or we're going to stop trying to attract people to our community because we hope that technology is going to sort of come in as a panacea and just solve all our workforce issues. I just don't think that's the case. And like I said, with driverless trucks, that's one example, but there's many, many more. So we need to, when we're planning for the future, we need to work with what we know for sure or have a good sense of. And we need to understand there's other things out there like technology that's changing and could change things. And that's fine. We'll have to pivot as those things happen. But we can't just sort of sit back and say, okay, here comes technology that's going to solve our problems, because other jurisdictions are not. Other jurisdictions are doing what they need to do. to attract the talent and grow the talent to grow their economies across Canada and around North America. So yeah, I would just conclude by saying let's understand the technologies are coming. They're going to change things. We need to be aware of it. We need to understand how it's impacting our workforce. But we can't put our head in the sand and just assume that technology is going to solve all our workforce problems.
Perfect. Thank you. You've already covered our next question regarding AI and automation. So just to wrap up, if you had one key message, depending on the size, I would say, of the municipality, large urban center, mid-sized municipalities, or rural, what would it be when planning toward the 2035?
So for the larger municipalities, I would say the smaller municipalities are fundamentally important partners for the large urban areas because they amplify your role as an urban center, whether it's the city of Moncton or the city of Dieppe or even the town of Riverview. If you didn't have access to those rural communities, you would not have the population and market benefits of those rural communities. In other words, the city of Moncton is the largest city in the region, but being part of the Southeast region, they have access to 250,000 people. So I still think the urban centers, the cities, need to understand that they benefit from having these rural partners all across the region. The rural areas also the smaller communities need to understand they benefit from being adjacent to the large urban centers. So that's why we've been talking about the synergies and the interconnectedness of the urban and rural areas. So sometimes there's a little tension there. The cities are, well, we're the cities, and the smaller communities say, well, we're kind of bullied by the big cities. And I'm not sure that happens much in this region. I don't know. But I would just encourage them both, and this Vision 2035 process sort of confirmed the fact that everybody benefits. They're mutually beneficial. Living in a community that's adjacent to the city of Moncton means you have access to all of the services in Moncton, but Moncton wouldn't be able to have all those services if it didn't benefit from the wider population. So that's the kind of broader frame there that I'd like to communicate. The other one, particularly with respect to the smaller and more rural communities, is that it's not even so much about the workforce, it's about demographic renewal for the future. Like, what kind of community of Three Rivers, what kind of community do you want that to be in 20 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, right? Cap-Acadie, Salisbury, Shediac, Maple Hills, Memramcook. What's your vision for your community? And if you don't get the demographics right, it was so there is you could say the vision for my community is to become a retirement community. That could be a vision. We want to just be a place where people can retire. We won't worry about services. People will have to drive to adjacent communities if they want to get services. If that's your vision for your community, I'm not going to criticize that. That could be your vision. I'm not sure it's a particularly sustainable vision, because then the schools disappear, the K-12 schools disappear. There's not enough workers even to meet the demand for local services like healthcare that you want to have in the local community. And I think at the end of the day, I would encourage and all of the councils in all 12 communities to think that this is not just about workforce. It's about making sure that we have a prosperous and thriving community in 10 years, in 20 years, well beyond our mandates as in council. But that's the long-term vision. And again, if you go back 20 and 30 years in the past, you didn't have the same pressures because the workforce was younger, even in the rural areas. You had a greater supply of local population because the birth rate was higher than the death rate. And so the demographics have just fundamentally changed. And I think that's the sort of key lesson for them in this process, is to make sure, as we look to the future, we're attractive to young families. We have the services and support for young families, and we can grow and rebalance our demographics over the next 10 years. And then when we look back 10 years from now, we can say, job well done. We've through good housing policies, through good investments in recreational infrastructure, through a deliberate attempt to make sure we've got local services in the community, we've actually bent the demographic curve. We're a little younger now than we were 10 years ago, and that would constitute success. So hopefully through this process, we've illuminated that challenge, we've illuminated those opportunities, across the region, communities can feel or understand what those opportunities are and work toward them.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for this has been a really insightful discussion. I think one of the key takeaway is that while municipalities face different realities, their future are closely connected, rural or urban, and that regional thinking will be essential moving forward. Thank you to anyone who joined us today. If you have any question, feel free to ask David or me. Feel free also to share them in the chat if it's more convenient.
I'm happy to take any questions offline. You can send me an email. You can find me on LinkedIn, and certainly you can find.
I have a question.
Okay.
If I look at your presentation in the eyes of a young family immigrating in the area, as you know, immigrating in a new place, the first thing you want to know, not necessarily if you have a job. That's important, very important, but that's not the only thing. Is you want to know what type of community am I moving into? Now, let's describe the community in your own words that you want to attract immigration to. It's an older community that does not reproduce, that has an economic problem, and they're trying to do something about it. My concern is that we are inviting immigrants to inherit our problems, and we should at first try to understand what has happened before inviting people, so that we know that what has happened in the past that did not work and really caused a big problem, that we do not inflict that problem or these problems onto an immigration population that comes here in good faith and wants to work. So my problem is all these explanations seems to be focused upon, let's bring new and younger people and they'll solve the problem. I would have liked to have seen a more deep understanding of the problem, what caused it, and how we're going to solve it in a way that when we invite immigration, that we do not inflict upon the newly arrived immigrants the same problem that we have.
So that's a good question. I appreciate that question. It would require a significantly longer answer, but I would say there's a few things I would respond to that. One is we did spend an awful lot of time and effort trying to convince young people that if they wanted to be successful, they had to leave the rural areas and move into the cities. And there are lots of people that want to move into the cities, but increasingly we are seeing, and the good news here is we have examples all across Atlantic Canada of newcomers that are settling in smaller rural areas and having success and putting down roots. Not everybody wants to live in a large city. And that's a new finding. And again, after COVID, that was actually accelerated. There are people in the world, people in Canada, that actually want to live in smaller communities. Now, we have to be deliberate about making those communities attractive for people. And that's why I talk about the importance of schools and healthcare and recreational infrastructure. But not everybody wants to live in a large urban center. So so now that I know that's kind of superficial for what you were trying to say. You're trying to look at sort of what are those deeper, more structural reasons why these communities have been declining. And at the end of the day, one of the things has been the deindustrialization. We've seen across New Brunswick and across Atlantic Canada, some of the heavy industry has moved out. But again, if you look at these reports, you see there's still lots of heavy industry. When I say heavy industry here, I'm talking about manufacturing, and I'm talking about some of the natural resource industries. So there's still viable career options across the region, urban and rural, that should be attractive to people. Now, if you're attracting people that want to live in cities and you're trying to get them to set up in the community of Three Rivers, it doesn't make sense. But you should try to find people that want to live in smaller communities. And again, there's the evidence is clear. We have people that have moved to places like St. Stephen and Kedgwick and other parts in our region, and they've been living there for 10 and 15 years. So we now have a track record of showing, that people will move to rural areas. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not saying there's not some structural issues that you're kind of pointing to, but I think we have to just, figure that out and get to solutions. And at the end of the day, if our communities are good places to live, if people are friendly, if our neighbors are friendly and supportive of newcomers, if the schools are welcoming and the children do well in the schools, we have evidence that people will put down roots and will stay for the long run. And beyond that, we'd have to have a longer discussion to try and answer that question.
Okay, thank you. I see Marc Landry raised his hand. Go ahead, Mark, and ask your question.
Perfect. Thanks, David, for the update, and thanks, Rabab, for all the background work coordinating. I know we're kind of over time, but I just thought, as you know, David, at the regional level, a couple of the files that we're working on is, for example, regional transportation. So talking about the connectiveness of the region, we know Moncton, Dieppe, Riverview have fixed route service, but outside of that, it's really like volunteer base. So, we've been working at a regional level to look at what could that look like, how cost effective can that be? For example, microtransit, running shuttles maybe from the key points, whether it's Shediac, Tantramar, Salisbury, as you mentioned. I guess the reality is, though, when you start looking at the local level and seeing what investment would be required, and even where's the province to support some of those initiatives, or maybe they're at the short term where we look at other provinces that have really integrated regions like Quebec, Ontario, BC, and the province is there to support them. And I understand that we're in it's different realities even provincially, but I would just like your thoughts in terms of, how important should something like that be considered? We know a lot of people that are moving in our region here don't all move with automobiles, and a lot of individuals, say we've never been outside of Moncton, Dieppe, Riverview, to explore the region because we don't have that access. So your thoughts would be interesting just to get your feedback.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tricky challenge, Mark. Some communities have tried things like rural Uber, right? Trying to do better with ride sharing, and with more or less some success. There's issues around insurance and liability and all these issues. Some of the micro transit options you're looking at. I think it would be helpful if the region and the province had sort of a grander vision for what transportation looks like, what transportation infrastructure looks like, what public transportation looks like. You're absolutely right. A lot of people that move here, don't necessarily want to own a car. If you look at our seniors population, increasingly, they would prefer to have a shared option as opposed to having to own and operate a car, into their 80s and 90-year-old, but they still want to live in their rural communities. So I think there's I don't have any great answers to you on that front. We talked about a bit in these reports about transportation infrastructure, but I think it's a worthy investment on behalf of the region and municipalities and provincial government to be thinking about how we can stimulate more ride sharing and more innovative ways to get people from point A to point B throughout the region, and without having everybody have to own a vehicle. which does restrict their ability to get around if they don't. So I think it is a challenge. It's not just a challenge here; it's a challenge across the province and across the country. But I think I applaud you for working on those solutions, and hopefully we can come up with something that works, where people can find ways to get around without having to own a vehicle.
Yeah, no, thanks, David, for those comments. And we're actually taking the lead at the end of April, April 23rd and 24th. We're organizing in Southeast, bringing all the 12 regions together to talk about regional transportation. And the province is really excited. We have environment, local government, regional development corporation, possibly DTI. We have, all the players will be there. So anyways, it should be good to at least have dialogue and to see what's possible.
I wish you all the best. I think it's a very important initiative.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for the question, and thank you, David, for the insights. You have any other question?
Juste une dernière.
Oui, allez-y, Gabriel.
In the presentation that you've made, there is one subject matter that seems to be completely absent, that usually in most presentations of the southeast of New Brunswick, that they necessarily have to touch one way or another. I know it's not an issue that's easily resolved, but it's certainly an issue that is present and affects almost every planned solution, and that is the historical presence of two linguistic groups that are very entrenched and very located in the southeast of New Brunswick, that sometimes creates problems in relation to the flow of population in one area or another. And I thought maybe you had deliberately left it out because it's too complicated, or you simply avoided the subject matter altogether.
No, I didn't. And in fact, if you look at the Memro Cook report, we talk about the fact that it's the most bilingual community in New Brunswick and one of the most bilingual in the entire country in terms of the share of the population that say they speak English and French. We do talk about the fact that there's communities that are predominantly French, 80-90% French, and then others on the other side, the community of Three Rivers that are the opposite. We do talk about the fact that across the entire region, about 47% of the population speak French and English. So we do talk about those linguistic, the duality and the fact that we do have that's a great strength of the region, that we have people that speak French and English, and it brings cultural richness to the region. The fact that we have strong Acadian communities and all of the influences that go around that. So we do touch on that here, and that'll be touched on in the final report. But at the end of the day, we don't get into that subject matter from like service delivery and things like that. I think that has to be, addressed obviously at the municipal level and at the regional level. It's an important factor, making sure that people have access to services in the language of their choice and things like that. That's all important, particularly in our region, but of course province wide. But no, I didn't miss it. We do talk about it in specific communities. We do talk about it in this final report, and we do highlight it as a real advantage for the region on many in many fronts.
Perfect. Thank you, Gabriel, for reminding us about this importance of the bilingual community, and also David for the insights. If there is another question, or if there are no further questions, we will go ahead and wrap up.
Well, thank you for hosting. I appreciated being here. And if anybody has any questions, they can reach out to you, or they can reach out to me, and I'll try to answer them after the session.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you again to everyone who joined us today. Truly appreciate your time and engagement. And thank you again, David, for the real insights today. We look forward to continuing the conversation and our future session or our future webinar. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.